Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're literally going to reverse engineer a tragedy. We're looking at the MV Sewol, a passenger ferry that went down in 2014. Because, a ship doesn't just sink because of the water outside of it, right? It sinks because of catastrophic flaws inside of it. We're going to unpack the mechanical failures, the deep-seated corporate greed, and the shocking institutional negligence that caused this disaster. We'll use the data, the timelines, and the investigation records to understand exactly how a routine voyage turned into a complete systemic collapse. But before we get into the mechanics, we absolutely have to start with this number, 304. That is the number of lives lost beneath the waves. The Sewol ferry disaster isn't just an engineering failure or some legal case study. It remains one of South Korea's absolute worst maritime disasters. Keeping this heartbreaking human cost in mind is crucial as we break down exactly how so many safeguards were bypassed. Okay, part 1, the MV Sewol disaster. Let's look at how incredibly fast things went wrong on the morning of April 16, 2014, on what was supposed to be a completely routine, scheduled trip from Incheon to the resort island of Jeju. And the human stakes here? Just absolutely heartbreaking. Out of the 476 people on board, a huge chunk of them, 325 to be exact, were just second-year high school students from Danwon High School on a field trip. When you picture that, you really start to grasp the immense panic and just how completely these kids had to rely on the adults who were supposed to keep them safe. What's really wild is the sheer speed of this disaster. At 8:52 a.m., the very first sign of trouble wasn't even reported by the crew. It was actually a high school student dialing an emergency number from his cell phone. Just 3 minutes later, the crew broadcast that fateful order telling everyone to just stay in their cabins. The Coast Guard shows up at 9:30, and by 10:51 a.m., the entire ship has completely slipped underwater. Barely 2 hours from that first frantic phone call to total submersion. Which brings us to part 2, a fatal rescue effort, and a catastrophic failure of leadership. Because as that ship tilted, the actions of the people in charge literally sealed the fate of those trapped inside. So there's this jarring, almost unbelievable contrast in the evacuation. On one hand, you've got these passengers, mostly teenagers, obediently staying put in their cabins just like the announcements told them to. The captain, Lee Jun-suk, later claimed he delayed the evacuation because he was worried about people getting swept away by cold currents before rescue boats arrived. But on the flip side, the captain and his crew were the absolute first people to abandon the sinking ship. When the Coast Guard showed up, they saved a mere 20 people in their first 40 minutes on the scene, and it was mostly that very same captain and crew fleeing while making zero attempt to go inside and help the trapped passengers. And as if that wasn't chaotic enough, misinformation was spreading like wildfire. Get this, an official message from Danwon High School authorities went out during the disaster boldly claiming that all 338 students and teachers had been rescued safely. Completely false. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just false, it was dangerously misleading. By putting that out there, they massively downplayed the crisis, which very likely slowed down the urgency of the rescue, right when seconds literally meant the difference between life and death. Compounding this tragedy, South Korean officials actually rejected international offers of help. No, really. When the Japanese Prime Minister offered immediate dive support, the South Korean Coast Guard basically responded, "We very much appreciate the offer, but currently we have no special need for assistance." They said that while hundreds of children were still trapped inside a sinking hull. It is just a stunning, stunning display of institutional failure. Moving on to part 3, mechanics of the sinking. Let's peel back the layers and look at why a massive ferry suddenly lost control on a totally routine route. Investigators looked at the automatic identification system data from the ship, and they traced the actual sinking down to 3 specific physical steps. First, there was a really sharp right turn of the steering wheel. Second, because the crew hadn't properly tied down the cargo, that sharp turn caused all this massive heavy freight to just smash violently into the side of the ship. And third, because the ship had been illegally modified to squeeze in more passengers and cargo, its center of gravity was already way off, so it listed hard to the port side, drifted sideways, and just totally lost control. But it's the deadly math behind this that shows exactly why the ship couldn't recover. The legal limit for cargo was 987 tons. They loaded 3,608 tons. That is almost 4 times the legal limit. And to keep a ship that size stable, you need ballast water. They were required to have 1,703 tons of it, but they only carried 580 tons. So they basically hollowed out the ship's stabilizing weight just to cram in heavy, illegal, unsecured cargo. Once it tipped over, physics pretty much dictated it was never coming back up. Part 4, a web of corruption. Because you have to wonder, right? How does a ship operating with those insanely dangerous metrics pass any kind of inspection? Well, that leads us right into a really dark, shadowy network of corporate greed. $2. That's not a typo or a clerical error. $2 was the entire annual safety training budget for the Sewol's crew the year before it sank. $2. And it was literally just used to buy a paper copy of a certificate. So when the disaster actually hit, it is absolutely no wonder that so many crew members had no clue what emergency procedures to follow. The company running the ferry, Chonghae Marine, was basically rotting from the inside out. They completely falsified documents with the Korean Register of Shipping to hide those deadly modifications. In fact, the original captain of the ferry actually warned the company that the ship was dangerously off balance. And you know what they did? They threatened to fire him. And the regulators? Investigators found that corrupt regulators would routinely judge the ferry's weight just by eyeing how low the ship sat in the water instead of doing proper tests. This entire toxic corporate culture was run by former chairman Yoo Byung-un, who used a complex web of businesses and a church he founded to embezzle millions, consistently putting illegal profits way ahead of human life.
All right, part 5, justice and political fallout. As the bodies were painstakingly brought up by divers over the following months, a huge demand for justice completely consumed South Korea. It targeted everyone from the cowardly crew up to the highest office in the nation.
First, let's talk about the captain. He was initially sentenced for manslaughter, but an appeals court actually upgraded Captain Lee Jun-sok's sentence to life in prison for murder. They delivered this incredibly scathing indictment, pointing out that he abandoned passengers whose safety solely depended upon the captain's instructions. The court just flat out rejected the crew's claims that they tried to issue evacuation orders. They noted that if they had, there would have been a fast, organized rescue effort. Instead, they just lied to save their own skin. Meanwhile, the main corporate architect of the disaster, former chairman Yoo Byung-un, went completely into hiding. It sparked this massive national manhunt. He literally became the most wanted man in South Korea with a nearly $500,000 bounty on his head. But the manhunt ended pretty grimly when his heavily decomposed body was discovered in a fruit orchard months later. A massive wave of legal consequences hit hard after that. The systemic failures were so bad that the South Korean government actually completely disbanded the Coast Guard. Imagine that. The captain of the very first Coast Guard ship to arrive, jailed for 4 years just for falsely reporting he'd broadcast an evacuation order. The Chonghae CEO got 7 years, and several members of the Yoo family were extradited and thrown in prison for embezzling tens of millions of dollars, money that absolutely should have been spent on keeping those vessels safe. But you know, the investigations didn't just stop at the corporate level. Impartial findings revealed that the political fallout went all the way up to President Park Geun-hye. During the absolute most critical window of the disaster, the president was totally unaccounted for 7 hours. Reportedly, she was getting her hair and makeup done and meeting with her confidant, Choi Soon-sil. Now Choi, who was the daughter of a cult leader, was using her unauthorized access to the president to literally extort millions from massive companies like Samsung. And get this, the administration actually created an illegal blacklist of thousands of artists who dared to criticize how the government handled the Sewol disaster. Eventually, this whole sprawling scandal, which was entirely triggered by the scrutiny of the sinking, led to President Park being impeached and sentenced to 25 years in prison. So this all brings us to a question that really lingers long after the waters have settled. When a disaster is built on decades of systemic corruption, from a $2 safety budget to falsified cargo manifests to a paralyzed rescue operation and a distracted, corrupt government, who is ultimately to blame? We've traced this failure from a sharp turn of a steering wheel all the way up to the presidential office. It really challenges us to look closely at the institutions we rely on every single day. So what are you taking away from this tragedy? And maybe more importantly, how do we make sure the systems we trust are actually built to protect us? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.